What's going on, everyone? So today's video is 5 things that I think anyone could do to improve their overall Anki experience. I actually think this video is useful for anyone who is trying to improve the memorization and also anyone inside and outside of medicine. So if that's you, stick around. I really do think you'll find this useful. Let's do it. All right, let's get straight into it. We got a new mic, so hopefully this is better audio quality than the rest of my videos. So today we're going to talk about 5 ways to make the most of Anki for any student. So not just medicine, although I know I talk a lot about medicine. We're going to apply it to pretty much anyone who uses Anki for anything, whether it's law or business, which is what I'm doing right now. So the first way you can make the most of Anki is to not purely rely on pre-made decks. So what I mean by that is I think at least in medicine, there's too many pre-made decks, which is good because they kind of condense everything. But the problem is they interfere with what I like to call like your memory palace, which is a Sherlock term for sure. But the point is, I think pre-made decks are good because they have all the information there, but you're using someone else's memory as a proxy of your own. And so you're not getting the most bang for your buck. So what I try to do is even if you use a pre-made deck, you have to still integrate that pre-made deck into your own memory in your own unique way. And the reason I like to think of it this way is because I think one of the key rules that I've learned through doing enough Anki is that to memorize something, you need to make it personal to you. At least for me, the more personal something is for me, the more I remember like a particular detail because I'm like, oh yeah, I spent like 50 minutes on this one topic researching it on my own, the more likely you are to remember it. So when you use pre-made decks, you're often losing that personal aspect. So to make it more personal, what I try to do is you use the pre-made decks, so you'll download them and have them in your Anki, but I still have my own personal deck for everything I'm studying. So in a sense, the pre-made decks are a database, and what I'll do is as I learn things, I will pull things from that pre-made deck database into my own database. And what that allows me to do is really essentially move things from someone else's memory into my memory with a different context. Because if you just start purely doing pre-made decks in the same way that you're given, what you're essentially doing is going through someone else's contextual memory or the way they went about making the cards, and you're trying to replicate that. And the problem with that is sometimes it might work, more often than not it won't, because you're not the same as another human being. So you need to figure out what works for you, and especially like as you go through concepts, bring things from those pre-made decks into your own. So let me now show you how I do that using my own Anki. All right, so now you'll see my Anki, and again, you'll notice that at the very bottom, I have all of these pre-made decks. Like none of these decks are my own. Like Dope Anatomy is its pre-made deck. Ankiing is like the most common pre-made deck. Anatomy is another pre-made deck. But I rarely even touch these decks. I kind of just leave them here, and I think if you've watched many of my other videos, you'll know that I don't do any of these. What I then do is, let's say I was studying for, I don't know, step 1, which is what this was, week 1, week 2, all the way down. And I just kind of like started studying in December and I kind of kept going. And what you'll see is for each week, I started pulling cards that were relevant in that week. So let's say in week 1, I learned a bunch of hematology. I would have pulled a bunch of hematology cards from the Anki deck into my week 1 deck. And again, what I'm doing there is adding my own context to the material. There's no reason for me to go off of someone else's context because for me, I'm studying hematology week 1. So hematology is the most relevant. And so it's important for me to frame that in my context. Similarly, you'll also see I've done the same thing with my preclinicals. So in preclinicals, we go through cardio, you go through hematology, you go through rheumatology, you go through everything, but you go through it at a different way for each medical school. And so the way we do it at Yale is we often have these like modules that are called like Across the Lifespan or Connections to the World. And so I made Anki decks for each of those, and as we went through particular concepts, so Connections to the World was all neurology, I would pull the neurology relevant cards from the neurology relevant Anki deck into my Connections to the World deck. And again, what you're seeing here is I'm removing the context of the Anki deck and adding my own context, which is the Connections to the World, which really facilitated memorization, at least personally for me. And now what's going to even help moving forward, and I'm going to come to this in the next video, or in this video actually, is that now when I want to refer to something in neurology, I don't have to go through the Anki deck. I can just say like, oh, neurology for me was in Connections to the World. So I go to Connections to the World, and then I have my own contextual frame to kind of realize where I put the material. And so this is the perfect segue into my second point, which is organization. So the only way this first tip will work is if you organize your Anki in a way that is going to be most meaningful to you. Although that can often differ from one person to another, I have found some common themes that tend to work repeatedly from different types of people. And usually what I'll do is I will separate things by class or subject, or by time, or by both. And so what I mean by that is I told you earlier, don't just rely on pre-made decks, make your own decks. But once you make your own decks, organize them in a way that will be best for you to remember. And again, this will apply to anything, not just medicine. So I'm going to now show you how I did this for my MBA classes and how it actually works pretty damn well. Okay, so you can see here, I'm going to get rid of my medicine deck for a second. And you'll see that I've actually separated all of my MBA stuff by my 001 MBA classes. I have the 001 there just so it appears at the top. But you'll see that I have separated up in terms of subject and time. So fall 1 was our first fall quarter in MBA school. So I said, okay, here are all my fall 1 classes. And so under fall 1, you'll see I have accounting, microeconomics, and I have linear programming. And for each of these, I actually then separated them further by time. And so you'll see in accounting, I'll have week 1 all the way down to week 7. And this was a 7-week course. So it's perfect because now let's say, I don't know, 80 years down the line, I somehow am like, oh, I remember learning something random in my accounting class. Everything is right here under fall 1, under the accounting module, such that I actually can say, okay, this is where it was in my memory. Let me line my memory up with my computerized form of my memory and see if I can figure out what it is I'm trying to refer to. And this is like one of the implicit benefits, again, that I'm going to hint on at the end of the video, which is Anki actually is like, even if you don't end up doing any of the flashcards, it's a phenomenal database of information that is going to be personalized to you, right? I remember like in middle school, all of us would just have like my documents and you'd have a bunch of shit in your documents about everything you did. But now for me, Anki has taken that spot. And the cool part about Anki is like it's all in one place. And when I search Anki, I'm searching through like essentially an entire memory base of everything that I've learned since I started using this platform, which I find fascinating. So let's say there was like, I don't know, something in accounting that I wanted to learn about. I could just go into accounting and I browse accounting and actually then learn or see what exactly it was I was confused about and like find that specific concept, which I find to be fascinating. So the third big point I want to make about making the most of Anki is to annotate your cards. I've said this multiple times in multiple different videos, but this video is addressing the biggest things that I think anyone should take away using Anki, and that is to annotate. And this means not just annotating your own cards, but also the pre-made cards that you bring in. This is the same principle as I mentioned earlier, where I think the more personal you're able to make a particular concept, you know, the more likely you are to remember it, right? Like the most evident case of this is when something happens to you or your own health, you're more likely to remember that because it's very personal to you. It's the very same concept, except now in flashcard format. So what do I mean by annotate? What I mean by annotate is for every flashcard, whether it's one you make on your own or one that you take from someone else, you want to always include a couple sentences of your own interpretation of that topic, particularly if it's a topic that you're struggling with, right? And then the next thing is, on top of including a couple sentences and verbalizing the concept in your own words, also try to include one or more pictures. Pictures are worth 1,000 words, and so pictures will really help put things into context, and that way when you refer back to it, you have a particular concept schema there with the picture that you can always use to relearn the concepts if you forget it. For the USMLE, this is particularly useful because everyone uses first aid. So some people, if they have the PDF version of first aid, will include snippets of first aid in the Anki card as their picture. But again, it's not just for medicine. Like I'm going to show you some business cards I made, and you'll see that even for business courses, you could do this. So here's an example, right? Here's a flashcard. It says interstitial restrictive lung disease is a restrictive lung disease that decreases DLCO, which is the diffusion capacity, and increases the AA gradient. This is a random factoid that anyone might just be like, cool, I can memorize this. But when I was learning this, I personally was like, okay, I'm going to spend time learning this. So I watched like a 15-minute video on it. And when I watched the video on it, I was like, okay, I get it, right? Like diffusion capacity has to do with the alveolar interface. And so when you have something that actually destroys that interface, your diffusion capacity is decreased. And when your diffusion capacity is decreased, the partial pressure in the alveoli are entirely different from the partial pressures in like the arterial bloodstream. So your AA gradient increases. And so you'll see like I kind of summarized that brief understanding of that schema right there in my own like words. And then under that, I actually included the alveolar gas equation, which actually tells you what the AA gradient is, right? if I hadn't annotated this card is useless to me. Like if I came back to this 50 years down the road when I forgot all my medicine, this makes zero sense because I would have forgotten what diffusion capacity was, I would have forgotten what AA gradient was, but I already annotated this card such that if I come back to it with like a tabula rasa plate and don't know anything, I can actually retabulate like all of that information because it's right here. So this is what I mean by annotate. Let me give you some more examples. So here's another flashcard. The front of the flashcard says, how does the PDA typically present? And the answer is that it usually presents with lower extremity cyanosis in a child. And again, this is just a random concept, which if you didn't annotate, this is just something you might think you have to memorize, but there is a fundamental reason this presents the way it does, right? Like the PDA is what connects the aorta to the pulmonary artery, and if it's patent, it means it's open. Things go from high pressure to low pressure, so things would eventually end up going, it says here, it goes from left to right, but once it gets bad enough, it will then go right to left. It becomes a right to left shunt. And so essentially you get lower extremity cyanosis because any right to left shunt causes cyanosis. And you'll see that the only reason I'm able to remember all of this stuff is because I've annotated and I'm reading off of these notes and I'm like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And you'll see that I've also included a picture and I'm like, oh yeah, perfect, right? So if I came back to this and I forgot why exactly the answer was what it was, I actually have a framework for it. Here's another one. So this one is a more simple one. It says, what is the result of a dexamethasone suppression test in like a ACTH secreting tumor? And this is more of an algorithmic thing, but you'll see that I included the picture of the algorithm where you use dexamethasone suppression test, and I told you why you get the answer that you do with my own particular sentence. So I think, again, annotating is very useful, but as I said, it's not just limited to medicine. So let me show you how I've been doing this for business classes. In business school, I took microecon, and so in microecon, we learned a lot about consumer surplus and producer surplus. And I was like, yo, what the hell are each of these things? So when I made a flashcard describing both of them, I included a picture, and I also included my own understanding. Oh, consumer surplus is like the excess a consumer is left with after the market equilibrates. Same thing with producers, the excess the producers are left with after a market equilibrates, right? And I included a nice little picture. I did it for accounting as well. So you'll see in accounting, things that are important are debits and credits. So debits, I believe, are on the left side or right side. I think it's the left side. And then credits are on the right side. And so you'll see that I included a picture of all of that here. And you'll see I just relearned this concept right now as I'm talking you through this because I included my own understanding of it. So the good part about annotating is that it gives you the means to relearn things. I did the same with linear programming. So when we did linear programming in business school, I was like, okay, there's a concept called a shadow price. What is the shadow price? How do we talk about the shadow price? I defined the shadow price. I also included an example where the shadow price is mentioned. And so again, having the full context there, so that way if and when I want to come back to this concept, I have a pretty thorough understanding of it here. So the fourth concept I want to talk about is that Anki is more than just doing flashcards. So what I mean by this, I think people use Anki to memorize things, which is fantastic. I think that is definitely the main point of Anki. But what you're also missing out on is if you use Anki long enough, it ends up becoming a database of information that you've amassed since you started using it. So I already hinted at this earlier, that even if you don't do Anki regularly, if you're using it, if you're making cards on it, like for example, my business school finals that just finished, I used Anki quite a bit to learn concepts, but during the finals week, I didn't actually use Anki at all. I was like, screw it, I'll just do the practice finals and I'll just take the finals, which was fine. But the good part is now with all of my Anki flashcards, I have my database of information in those subjects. So if I want to ever relearn accounting, I have my 7 weeks of accounting notes just like easily accessible, which I think is such an underrated aspect of Anki. I did the same thing in medicine, right? I had been doing Anki since first summer of medical school. And so by the time I was in the hospital doing my clerkships, I had quite a bit of information handy just through my Anki, and Anki is also on your phone. So like, let's say they would ask me a question about, I don't know, anemia or something. I would be able to look that concept up right away on my Anki cards and be like, oh yeah, I remember learning about this. And I would be able to give myself a refresher much more quickly than if I had to look it up on Google or up to date. Because on Anki, you have your own filter and your own memory palettes that's kind of telling you how you learned the concept in the first place. To really hit this home, I included a picture of my Anki right now. You'll see that it's about 13 gigabytes. It's a large database of information. And it's a database of information that I've collected over the last 4 years at this point. So it makes sense that it's large, right? Because it includes all of medical school and then it also includes now a little bit of business school. And I've also started using Anki for other things, like some consulting skills I'm learning. I'm like, I would love to refer to these consulting skills later on down the line. So I also have a consulting deck and things like that. So last but not least, the fifth thing that anyone should use is the search function on Anki. This is the most important probably after you have a database, probably just like mine, like 13 gigabytes worth. The search function becomes a way of searching your memory palace, essentially, because Anki ends up being your memory palace. It ends up being like, oh my God, here's everything you've ever learned or touched or thought about, and you have that right here at your fingertips. And so I actually use the search function a lot on Anki, especially now, right? So I'm not in medicine. I'm not doing medicine right now. I'm in business school, but I still volunteer at the free clinic on the weekends. And so the cool part is on the weekends, I have to turn on my medicine brain. And sometimes that transition can be a bit more rough because I haven't been doing medicine actively. So this last, I think 2 weeks ago, we had a patient basically who we were trying to see, is this iron deficiency anemia or anemia of chronic disease? And I was like, oh my God, I remember learning this, but it's totally escaping me right now. So what I did was within 30 seconds, I looked it up on my Anki and I just instantly knew what we were talking about, right? Because I was searching my own database of information and I knew I had covered these concepts before, but I was just a little rusty on like ferritin, TIBC, total iron levels, all of that stuff. And I was like, I also kind of remember the pathophys of this, but let me review. And so let me walk you through what we did because I just felt like it was like really valuable and I've been doing this a lot more and I've been using the search function on Anki more. So if you guys situated here, you'll see that I went to my medicine deck. And then what I did was I was like, okay, what we're trying to differentiate between is anemia of chronic disease and iron deficiency anemia. And I remember, I'm sure I have a bunch of cards on this. See that these cards came up right away because I knew I had gone over it. And so right away I was like, okay, let's look at these cards. And I looked at them and what do you know? I have my annotation that kind of describes exactly what happens. Iron comes in, binds to transferrin, which is responsible for taking it around. It's also stored in the liver as ferritin. I have my nice little annotation here that tells me all the different lab values. And right away, within like seconds, I knew I had also watched a YouTube video on the subject and I included a screenshot. I was like, oh, I totally know exactly what's going on and how to differentiate between these two. So this is just one small example of the search function on Anki and just how useful it is. I would definitely recommend make sure like you keep everything you've ever learned in Anki around because you never know when it's going to be useful. So yeah, these were my 5 tips. Hopefully these were helpful, especially for anyone who's even not in medicine. I believe everything I talked about can be applicable for law, business, as you saw, accounting, whatever it is. So thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions, let me know. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Peace.